My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a senior archivist at Georgetown University's Special Collections Library. I've been working with historical manuscripts and rare books for 12 years now. My job involves cataloging, preserving, and researching some of the most valuable texts in American academia. It's meticulous work, but I love uncovering the stories these old documents tell about our past. But 6 months ago, something happened that completely changed how I view the relationship between knowledge and power throughout history. It started when we received a private donation from the estate of Cardinal Francesco Torretti, who had passed away at 91. The cardinal had been a prominent figure in Vatican historical research for decades, and his personal collection was supposed to contain mostly standard theological texts and church histories. Nothing particularly exciting, just the kind of scholarly religious materials we catalog regularly. The donation came with very specific instructions. The cardinals will stated that certain items were to remain sealed for 25 years, while others could be processed immediately. Standard procedure for sensitive materials. What wasn't standard was the accompanying letter from the Vatican archives, requesting that we notify them before examining any pre-15th century manuscripts. Have you ever wondered why the Catholic Church maintains such extensive archives, yet so little of their historical research ever sees the light of day? I began with the immediate access materials. Standard stuff, commentaries on scripture, correspondence with other theologians, published works on church history. But buried among these routine texts, I found something that didn't belong. A small, unmarked wooden box containing what appeared to be photocopies of much older documents. The photocopies were of manuscript pages written in Latin, but the style and content were unlike anything I'd seen in typical church archives. These weren't theological discussions or biblical commentaries. They were detailed instructions for what could only be described as early scientific experiments, chemical processes, astronomical calculations, and medical procedures that seemed far too advanced for their apparent age. One document caught my attention immediately. It was titled De Transmutationis Metallorum, on the transmutation of metals. But as I read through the Latin text, I realized this wasn't mystical alchemy. It was chemistry, real chemistry, with precise measurements, temperature controls, and step-by-step procedures that would produce actual results. The formulas described processes for refining metals, creating compounds, and even early forms of what we now call pharmaceutical chemistry. There were detailed instructions for extracting and purifying various substances, along with notes about their medicinal properties. This was sophisticated science, not superstition. But here's what really disturbed me. At the bottom of several pages were stamps marked Suppressa and Index Prohibitus. These documents had been deliberately suppressed by the Church and placed on the Forbidden Index. I decided to research the origins of these photocopies. Using the manuscript dating techniques I'd learned in graduate school, I could tell the originals were likely from the 13th or 14th centuries. But according to standard historical sources, advanced chemistry wasn't developed until the 16th and 17th centuries. That's when I found the first mention of something called the Celestine Collection. Have you ever noticed how many scientific breakthroughs seem to appear suddenly in history, as if the knowledge came from nowhere? I spent weeks researching the Celestine Collection through academic databases and historical archives. What I found was disturbing. References to it appeared in scattered sources throughout the late medieval period, always in the context of dangerous knowledge that needed to be contained. The collection was apparently named after Pope Celestine V, who abdicated the papacy in 1294 under mysterious circumstances. According to the few sources I could find, Celestine had gathered together manuscripts from various sources, Islamic scholars, Byzantine libraries, ancient Greek texts, and even some materials that had supposedly come from the Library of Alexandria before its destruction. But here's where it gets really interesting. I found a partially digitized record from the Vatican Secret Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, that mentioned a systematic program called Custodi Silentium, Keep Silent. This program, apparently active from the 13th through 16th centuries, was designed to identify and suppress any knowledge that could challenge church authority or accelerate human progress beyond what church leaders deemed appropriate. The documents I was looking at weren't occult grimoires at all. They were scientific treatises that had been deliberately mislabeled as magical, texts to justify their suppression. The Church had effectively controlled human scientific progress for centuries by hiding advanced knowledge and branding anyone who possessed it as a heretic or practitioner of dark arts. I found references to suppressed texts on astronomy that accurately described planetary motion centuries before Copernicus, medical texts with surgical procedures and pharmaceutical knowledge that wouldn't be discovered again until the Renaissance, mathematical works that contain concepts not officially recognized until the Enlightenment. The scope of what had been hidden was staggering. We're talking about potentially centuries of lost human progress. What do you think would have happened if this knowledge had been freely available during the Dark Ages? I decided I needed to see the original manuscripts, not just photocopies. According to the documentation, the originals were held in a restricted section of the Vatican archives, but there was also a note indicating that some materials had been transferred to associated institutions for safekeeping. I contacted a colleague at the Vatican Library who specialized in medieval manuscripts. Dr. Elena Rossini had worked there for 15 years and had access to materials most researchers never see. When I described what I'd found, there was a long pause on the phone. "Marcus," she said finally, "you need to be very careful about this. Some knowledge comes with consequences." She agreed to meet me during her next research trip to the United States. When Elena arrived at Georgetown 3 weeks later, she brought with her something that would change everything I thought I knew about the history of human knowledge. Elena had managed to obtain official documentation from the Vatican archives about the Custodi Silentium program. The papers she showed me were mind-blowing. This wasn't just casual censorship. It was a systematic, multi-century effort to control human intellectual development. The documents detailed specific categories of knowledge that were to be suppressed: advanced mathematics that could lead to engineering breakthroughs, astronomical observations that contradicted geocentric models, medical knowledge that reduced dependence on prayer and church rituals, and chemical processes that could be used for anything from metallurgy to medicine. But the most shocking revelation was the scope of the operation. The Church had agents in universities, monasteries, and courts throughout Europe whose job was to identify dangerous knowledge and either acquire it for suppression or eliminate it entirely. They had a network that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. One document dated 1623 listed over 400 individual manuscripts that had been acquired and secured in just that single year. Another detailed the Church's infiltration of emerging scientific societies to monitor and control their research. Elena told me something that still gives me chills. The Church didn't just suppress knowledge, Marcus. They actively promoted ignorance. They spread false information, funded flawed research, and eliminated scholars who got too close to dangerous truths. According to these documents, many of the scientists we consider pioneers were actually rediscovering knowledge that had been deliberately hidden for centuries. The scientific revolution wasn't the beginning of advanced human knowledge. It was the recovery from centuries of enforced ignorance. Do you ever wonder how different our world might be if human scientific progress hadn't been deliberately sabotaged for 600 years? The more I learned, the more I realized I was in over my head. Elena warned me that even today, there are powerful interests within the Vatican that prefer this history remain hidden. She'd only been able to access these documents because of a recent change in archival policy. And even then, she was taking significant professional risks. Then something happened that proved she was right to be worried. 2 weeks after Elena's visit, I received a call from the university administration. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about my research methods, claiming I was making unauthorized copies of donated materials and potentially violating the terms of the Torretti estate donation. I was ordered to halt all research on the Cardinal's collection pending a full review. When I asked who had filed the complaint, I was told it came from interested parties who preferred to remain anonymous. The next day, Elena called me from Rome. Her voice was shaky. She'd been transferred to a different department at the Vatican Library and was no longer allowed access to the restricted archives. Her supervisor had told her that her research had attracted unwanted attention and that she needed to focus on more appropriate scholarly pursuits. But Elena had anticipated this. Before losing access, she'd managed to photograph additional documents that revealed something even more disturbing. The Custodi Silentium program hadn't ended in the Renaissance. It had evolved. The modern version operates through academic funding, publishing control, and professional pressure. Research that challenges certain historical narratives finds it difficult to get published. Scholars who pursue inconvenient lines of inquiry suddenly face funding cuts or career obstacles. Elena had documented dozens of cases over the past 50 years where researchers investigating church history had faced similar pressures. Some had their work discredited through coordinated academic attacks. Others had simply found their careers stalled until they moved on to safer topics. The system had become more sophisticated, but the goal remained the same: control the narrative and limit dangerous knowledge. Have you ever noticed how certain historical topics seem to be off limits to serious academic research, even in our supposedly open society? I realized I had to make a choice. I could drop the research, return the documents to sealed storage, and continue my career without complications. Or I could find a way to preserve and share what I discovered, knowing it would likely end my academic career. I chose to preserve the truth. Working carefully and quietly, I digitized everything I had access to before the university review process could confiscate the materials. I also reached out to several trusted colleagues at other institutions, sharing copies of the most important documents with researchers who could continue the investigation if something happened to me. 3 months ago, the university completed their review and sealed the Torretti collection permanently. The official reason was concerns about provenance and potential copyright issues. In reality, the collection was transferred to a private foundation with ties to certain Catholic organizations. But the truth is already out there. Copies of these documents are now in the hands of researchers at 6 different institutions. Academic papers are being prepared for publication, though I suspect they'll face significant opposition. What I've learned has changed how I view the entire history of human knowledge. We've been told that the Dark Ages were a natural period of intellectual stagnation, that the scientific revolution was the beginning of real human progress, and that the Church was simply protecting spiritual truth against dangerous secular ideas. The reality is far more sinister. Human intellectual development was deliberately suppressed for centuries by institutions that preferred an ignorant and dependent population. The knowledge existed. It was simply hidden from those who could use it to improve human life and reduce dependence on authority. And this pattern continues today, just with more sophisticated methods. Elena and I stay in touch through encrypted messages. She's found evidence that similar suppression programs operated in other religious and political institutions throughout history. The Church wasn't unique in wanting to control knowledge. They were just particularly effective at it. She recently sent me a document that keeps me awake at night. It's a contemporary memo from a Vatican advisory committee discussing information management strategies for the digital age. The language is modern, but the goals are ancient. Identify dangerous knowledge, control its distribution, and maintain institutional authority over human understanding. The memo specifically mentions concerns about uncontrolled historical research and the need for proactive narrative management in academic and media circles. Do you think the institutions we trust to preserve and share knowledge might actually be controlling what we're allowed to know? I want to ask you something. Have you ever wondered why certain scientific breakthroughs took so long to occur? Why it took centuries for humans to rediscover basic principles that earlier civilizations seemed to understand? Why the history of human progress seems to have so many mysterious gaps and sudden leaps forward? Maybe it's because progress wasn't natural. Maybe it was controlled. I'm sharing this story because I believe people deserve to know the truth about how knowledge has been manipulated throughout history. The documents I've seen prove that human intellectual development could have been centuries ahead of where we are now, if not for deliberate suppression. But I also want to warn you, if you decide to research this topic yourself, be careful. The methods have evolved, but the system still exists. Academic careers can still be destroyed. Research can still be suppressed. Knowledge can still be controlled. The question is, are you willing to seek the truth anyway? If you've experienced anything similar in your own research or work, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're an academic or researcher, maybe it's time to ask yourself, what might be hidden in your own institution's archives? The truth is out there, but it's not going to reveal itself. Someone has to be brave enough to look for it. What do you think? Are you ready to question what you've been told about the history of human knowledge?